Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So hello and welcome to a special episode we're recording with Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, who was the 32nd Foreign Secretary of India. He served as the ambassador to Germany and China and as the High Commissioner to Malaysia. And he's out with a new book on a very short file from the first book. And at the pace, it will be very hard for us to actually keep a track of the books that he's writing. So he's out with a book, The Long Game, How the Chinese Negotiate with India. So first of all, I would like to tell that while I was reading, I thought it's the way you have described in the book all the negotiation, it felt like we were actually in the getting a behind the scenes picture of what was happening. And it's a very fascinating read, not just for as students of geopolitics, but for any argumentative, rational Indian to actually understand how the Chinese have an upper hand when they come and negotiate with India. So thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and speaking to us.
Thank you, Ratnadeep. Thank you.
So at first, I want to start a little bit with the historical background that you mentioned this important thing that India and China both started together at the same time. Yet you mentioned that India had some drawbacks and flaws when it comes to the way our diplomats, or for example, the way we carried out negotiation, because they were not well trained. So how are the Chinese different from the Indians in that regard in the historical context?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I do want to start with is that, frankly, we also were at a disadvantage, partly for reasons not of our doing. You will recall that before 1947, we were a full colony of Great Britain. And therefore, Indians did not have any experience for at least 100 years or more of direct dealings with any other foreign country. All our foreign relations, to the extent that there were any, were done by the British Empire and by the British government of India, not by Indians. Therefore, we really lacked diplomatic experience. Now, this was not the situation with China, because in the case of China, there was only a partial colonialism or a partial colonization of China. The Qing Empire continued to live and survive, and therefore Chinese continued to have experience, direct dealings in diplomacy. Obviously, this was going to reflect when the two countries became independent, or when India became independent and when China was liberated, as they call it. And therefore, we started out with a disadvantage. In other words, we had complete lack of experience in diplomacy, whereas the Chinese had some experience. Now, the second thing, of course, was the manner in which we recruited our diplomats in the early years of our independence. And in fact, that continues till today. It is a general examination, as you know, the Union Public Service Commission examination. Anybody with any skill from history to electrical engineering can apply. You don't need to have a language background or a background in international relations to be selected for the Indian Foreign Service. Now, when the Chinese set up their diplomatic service in 1949, they went about it differently. They actually actively looked for people who were communist or communist in orientation or communist sympathizers and who had foreign experience. So, for instance, people from the army who had dealt with the British or the Americans or the Soviets during the Civil War and during the war against Japan, people who worked in the United Front Work Department, which is the department the Communist Party established to maintain connections with fraternal socialist parties and so on. So they got together a body of people with experience in dealing with foreigners. And more importantly, while they sacked or removed from office the diplomats of the former government, the pre-communist government, they kept many of them on as consultants. So they removed them from the frontline work because they couldn't trust them. But they kept their expertise. So to some extent, the manner in which both sides proceeded resulted in the Chinese perhaps setting up a more effective foreign policy making mechanism than we did. The last point which I bring out in the book is that despite all these constraints, we did have some advantages. We had retained our diplomats in China between the collapse of the pre-communist government and the establishment of the communist government. So we had people on the ground, boots on the ground, as it were. We also had government of India officials in both Tibet and in Sikkim, which was then a separate state or separate kingdom. These people did report, giving government of India valuable clues as to what the Chinese might be intending to do. And these clues were ignored. Now, of course, we can put some of this down to inexperience. We were not used to analysis. We were not used to the way foreigners thought. But if you put all these together, the absence of experience before independence, the structure we evolved after independence, and the fact that we didn't take reportage seriously enough, this immediately put us at a disadvantage.
Yeah, and I'll just give a brief overview for all the viewers who are watching this, that in the book you have given 5 different instances in the negotiation, the Tibet, the Pokhran, the Sikkim, the 1-2-3 deal, and Masood Azhar. So for the paucity of time, I won't be, of course, dealing with everything, and it's for the viewers to again go and pick up the book. I will just cover a couple of them, and my major interest of speaking is the last chapter, The Lessons for India, which is a really well-written chapter, and actually a chapter which brings a lot of this content, and it was more like a game of chess that we were watching while reading the book, that how the Chinese comes prepared. So, but before I go to there, I just want a couple of touch points on the historical context of Tibet. And since this is an area of debate among a lot of academic circles, that India did not leverage the Tibet card well enough, and it made a mistake by recognizing in 1950. So what's your take on that? And if you could briefly tell what happened during that time actually, and did India actually leverage that Tibet card properly?
Well, that's a separate debate, Ratnadeep, that is not part of my book. So I won't touch on that particular aspect. But I think it is important to note that very soon after we became independent, Tibet became important for us simply because our northern boundary had not been finalized. Or at least while we considered that it had been finalized, the people or the government on the other side of the boundary did not consider that to be the case. And it is important for your listeners to recall or to note that this was not just true with the communist government which took over in 1949. Even in 1947 and 1948, the previous government of China, as well as the Tibetan government of the Dalai Lama, both wrote to the government of India saying that we do not agree with your depiction of the boundary. So that is why Tibet became important to us. Now, where leverage is concerned, of course, ultimately leverage is a function of power, whether it is military, economic, or ideological. But we had certain things going for us, which perhaps we did not leverage. One was that we were already an established, recognized country in the world. Both India and the leadership of India had global stature. The new Chinese government, the communist government, was not only looked on with suspicion by much of the world, but it also needed to get legitimacy because it had overthrown another government by use of arms, by force. So in the first place, I think we had a certain sort of perception advantage on our side. We were an established, accepted democratic country, whereas this was a bunch of armed guerrillas who had stormed into Beijing and taken power, and they needed legitimacy. Secondly, of course, we had a certain historical presence and linkage in Tibet, which the Chinese did too, but which had broken between 1911 when the Chinese empire collapsed until 1950 when the Chinese communists came in there. So there were certain things we could do. Clearly, what we couldn't do was give military help because that wouldn't matter. we ourselves were not militarily strong at that time. We had just gained independence. Remember, we were fighting a war with Pakistan over Jammu and Kashmir in 1948 as well. That was an active border. So there were limitations with what we could do. But in fact, what happened is we didn't choose to do very much at all, even in a non-military fashion. We were more observers of the scene, even after the Chinese gave enough indication that they intended to retake Tibet, rather than do anything, even on the international scene, in the United Nations, for instance. Now, there was a reason for this. The reason was that the Indian leadership believed that friendship with China was important in a post-Second World War age when we were all finally free of European rule and we could manage our own destiny. And as Indians, we felt as a long civilization that our destiny was going to be a great destiny. And there was a feeling that China's was in a similar position and we needed to work together. So that's a matter of judgment. In hindsight, it's always easy to say that, you know, we were wrong or we were right. But when you're in that situation, you don't have the benefit of hindsight. But the fact also was that there were reports by our diplomats in various places suggesting that China's intentions were not what we thought. And therefore, the point I make in the book is, as diplomats, we need to pay closer attention to the facts on the ground and the reports that we are receiving, rather than to try and fit any country, not just China, into what is our frame of reference. And this is what we learned through those unfortunate incidents. And therefore, as I explained in the book much later on with the 4 other incidents I dealt with, that actually we learned from this and we were able to apply a lot of the lessons we learned, so that in fact, subsequently we came out of the negotiations in a fairly good position.
Yeah. So I want to quickly move to the 123 agreement. The others probably I won't cover much because I want to keep a time for the last chapter. So interestingly, you mentioned about how China was very insecure about about India getting legitimized with the 123 deal that will be signing with US. And in fact, yesterday as well, there was headlines of yours actually in the book. I don't know if people read the book later or not, but it was very clearly you mentioned that the left party, China tried to influence this through the left party to actually, and it was China's first foray into domestic politics of India by trying to influence the deal. And when it was not successful, it tries to create hindrance in a lot of ways. So I want to understand how did that India navigate through that, and probably it's one of the most successful ways actually of this navigation. And how do when you're looking and the deal is closed and it's been years, how do you look at that negotiation between the two countries?
So I think we had already learned a lot on how to negotiate when we had the nuclear tests in 1998, and where China had similarly tried to use international pressure, particularly through the United Nations Security Council resolutions, to corner us. At the bottom of this whole Chinese effort was the objective that if India became a legitimate nuclear weapons state, then China would find it that much more difficult to present its case that it was the unquestioned leader of Asia. Because in terms of population, in terms of size, in many other ways, we were similar. And remember, in 1998, our economies were also at a relatively similar level. Ours was about slightly over $500 billion, $500 and something billion, and they had just crossed $1 trillion. So it was 1:2, which was an acceptable gap. And therefore, China did not want to have a situation where another Asian power was equated to it. Now, it had successfully, of course, discredited Japan. Japan was clearly the dominant economic power in the region, but because of what it had done in the Second World War, not only in China, but in a large part of Southeast Asia, it was much easier to convince the region that Japan had much to answer for. This was not the case with India. Civilizationally, we had influenced a large part of the region for a good part of 2000 years. We had historical linkages with them. We had post-independence linkages with many of the countries, including Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, for instance. Therefore, the Chinese felt that nuclear parity would, in a sense, disadvantage them. So having learned from 1998 the way we handled the Chinese, one of the lessons I think we learned was that there is no point in a frontal attack. It is better to use other means to neutralize the Chinese rather than a frontal attack. So in fact, in the 1-2-3 deal, what we did was we worked the international circuit in the same way that China had worked the international circuit in 1998 and also in 2007, 2008 to ensure that our interests were taken care of. And therefore, it was a more nuanced diplomatic strategy. And because we had had a learning experience, we were also able to judge how the Chinese might do something, what they would do, how they would do it. And we were able to develop strategy and tactics to counter that. So, I don't want your listeners to therefore think that this is a very complex, very academic book. In fact, as you said, it's a very readable book. So the idea of writing the book was essentially to explain, to narrate how we were able to do all these things in a very practical way and in relatively simple language, so that any reader would get an idea and a sense of how we tackled what by then was a growing power, militarily and economically. And I think this will come in useful because, the fact is that even today we have to deal with them. And not just in government, people who want to do business with China, people who want to do science and technology research and development with China, education and so on. It will help them, and therefore, this recounting helps that process.
Yeah, and with this, a quick follow-up I have, and I will quote from your book as well. And you mentioned this, at least publicly, the Chinese stuck to their belief that India's fear of alignment with the US and its wish to be an independent great power, as well as strong opposition inside India against a closer alignment with the United States, would hold India back from bandwagoning with the US. And I'm mentioning this because it's a very important point that I want to ask you, because even now as well, when we actually go for any strategic alliance with the US, there's always this Cold War politics belief that comes that we have to be non-aligned, and what will happen with our close ties with China, or how will that get impacted if we have a strategic alliance with US. So, and later on in the book, you mentioned about how China used to play on India's fear or while negotiating. So how did India come out of that fear while actually going on to the 1-2-3 agreement?
Well, I think, first of all, non-alignment died in the 1990s, although the phrase itself and the idea would pop up for many more years, simply because once the Cold War ended and there was no second pole, who were you going to be aligned with or against? The United States was, broadly from 1990 to 2010, the only major pole in the world. China had not yet caught up, and the European Union was floundering for various reasons. So the idea of non-alignment seemed to be attractive to many people from the past, but it could not really be implemented on the ground. The question was, the whole foreign policy of India really between 1990 and 2005 or 2006 devolved around the idea of what we meant by strategic or decisional autonomy. That was the debate, not about alignment. In a sense, there was an alignment element to it because the opposite of autonomy is alignment. So the debate was, do we remain autonomous in the sense that act entirely on our own without any kind of linkage to anybody else, or do we align with somebody? This was the debate, not between non-alignment and alignment anymore. The essential thing we learned in this period was that you could have decisional or strategic autonomy if you build certain key levers for this. And one of these was Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee's decision to have the nuclear tests. the moment India became a nuclear weapon state, irrespective of whether the rest of the nuclear weapon states officially recognize that or not, you immediately gained an automatic autonomy. Because it is one thing to act against a non-nuclear weapon state, it is another case to act against a state with nuclear weapons, irrespective of whether you agree they are legitimate or not. And we immediately saw the way that countries changed their dealings with us. The other was, again, a demonstration by Prime Minister Vajpayee's government that despite the sanctions which came on India as a result of nuclear tests, the economy, far from catastrophically collapsing, actually did reasonably well. So that again bolstered India's confidence. And therefore, I think by the time Dr. Manmohan Singh became the Prime Minister, we had gained the confidence and, of course, the wherewithal to be sure that we were not going to be utterly dependent on somebody else. And it is this then that led to a more nuanced understanding of alignment, which is that that alignment is not on an ideological basis. It's not because we're a democracy or because we're a communist state or whatever. It is on an issues basis. In other words, on a particular issue, if your interest matches with that of any other country, you align with that country on that issue. And from this evolved the policy of multi-alignment. In other words, India decided we would improve relations with all the major powers, with Russia, of course, with the United States, with the European Union. This was the time we really improved relations with Japan beginning in 2000 and with China as well. So this was how this thing came along. And even today, this is the objective of the government of India, to my understanding, multi-alignment, which means you align with countries on issues. If on climate change, your position is closer to a particular group of countries or interests are served better by those group of countries, it makes sense to align. That doesn't mean that on another issue, you will align with the same set of countries. So it's a recognition in one way of our own capability. We can't stand as, we are not the United States of America. We can't stand on our own. On the other hand, it is a recognition of our own capacity. We do have the capacity to withstand pressure. We do have the capacity, because we are large enough as an economy, as a population, as a territory, to be autonomous, to not fall under pressure of somebody else and do something we don't want. So that is the way in which we have to make policy.
Yeah. And this is the next question is something which is probably, there are certain events or speeches that gets embedded in our nation's memory as collective history. And for a lot of us, your speech, the press briefing at Balakot airstrike was one of them, actually. And I want to trace a little bit back to probably 2009 and 2019, in that period when India was trying to list Masood Azhar as a designated terrorist. And there was China who was actually trying to block it. And I will have two small questions on this. One is about, ultimately, as students of geopolitics, we're taught that any point of our foreign policy is our own domestic interest. So why does China actually is batting for Pakistan in this regard for certain geopolitical reasons, but why is going beyond its way and at a stretch where it might have to use veto power? And it has also at a point where it mentioned that it was a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan. Then, as you mentioned in the book, that the foreign minister that time, Sushma Swaraj, mentioned that it was between India and China rather than India and Pakistan. So first question is about why did China actually go too far for this blocking? And second is, tell us about this entire point where I think this is one of the most successful negotiations that India had in the past, where it actually puts China in one corner. Tell us about that.
So, I mean, why did China do this? It's very difficult to read the Chinese mind. As you correctly said, there was no domestic implication for China in agreeing to this. In fact, in a sense, it was a positive domestic implication, because China is also faced with the threat of terrorism. I guess they did it simply because they thought they could get away with it. In the power sense. Remember that by this time, the differentiation between the Indian and Chinese economies had grown from 1:2 to 1:4 or more, perhaps. Now, for us, it was a very long drawn out negotiation. And of course, we did achieve success at the end. But along the way, it was a lot of trial and error and a lot of learnings. We learned initially that we could not go it alone, because that was what we tried to do in 2009, 2010. We then also learned that you have to play the international or multilateral game, which means that you have to win over members of the Security Council. You have to make compromises, which we did, because eventually they never agreed that he was linked in any way to the Jaish-e-Mohammed and so on. It was eventually in terms of linkage to Al-Qaeda that he was sanctioned. So we had to make compromises along the way. At the end, of course, we had to seek assistance from others. But this is what diplomacy is about. I mean, diplomacy is never about going it alone. It is about evolving your approach so that your core interest is protected. And the means of achieving that core interest must be flexible. There is no one stipulated means of achieving a core interest. The point was, we made a proper assessment of the Chinese position towards the end. Having stretched it out for so long, they would have been hard-pressed to justify continuing doing so without seriously damaging their reputation for an issue which, as you correctly pointed out, they had no domestic motive. And therefore, I think, it was a lesson in two ways. One, that you need to, diplomacy is always a cooperative effort. Unless you were the United States of America, you might then be able to go it alone. But today, even the United States can't do that. And secondly, that I think persistence, a quality which the Chinese have, by the way, in their diplomacy, is important because you don't necessarily achieve your goal at once. It is a process. You should look at it as a process. You should keep adjusting strategy and tactics as you go along, and hopefully success will come at the end. So I think this is an important learning process for us in many ways.
Yeah, and now for the most exciting part about the lessons for India. So firstly, I want to start this very important thing that you mentioned, and for all the viewers, if you would like to state a little more on that, you mentioned two important things before starting this chapter, and those two were that there's a difference between negotiating from a democracy and a country like China, where they work for the party, keep the party before the country. And for us, it's a little different. And the other point is, you mentioned that there were very few books written from, especially India's perspective, because US negotiating with China, US is a superior. But India is inferior in terms of power sharing in the region. So tell us about these two factors, and I will ask you a little more about the negotiation in detail after that.
So I wrote the book essentially because I wanted to share experiences in the process of negotiation. So even the previous chapters are more about how the Chinese negotiation took place, and not necessarily a very detailed recounting of the relationship. But essentially, the process of negotiation is one where it is rarely between two equals in that sense. And all previous books were essentially written, a lot of them by Americans, which did not completely apply to us. Because as you correctly said, the Americans were the much bigger country for much of this time when negotiating with China. Whereas in our case, the Chinese are economically and militarily bigger than us. So the objective of writing the book was also to see how how the Chinese behaved with a country that was smaller to them in terms of the size of the economy or the military or what they call comprehensive national strength. That was, I think, one of the objectives. And the second objective of writing the book was to try and understand whether there were certain methodologies that they followed. And one of the important points was that we tend to treat the Chinese like any normal country, but they are not a normal country. Because unlike in a democracy where the civil servant owes loyalty to the constitution, under law, the Chinese are mandated to owe loyalty to the party. Therefore, there is a certain ideological line which also comes into the negotiation that is absent when the diplomats of democracies negotiate. And therefore, we need to factor that in. And this is something which I think is important for all Indians to understand. China is not a normal country. It is ruled by one party, and that party believes that all the instruments of the state, whether it is the army or the diplomatic service or the civil service, belongs to it, the party, and not to the country. And therefore, they must serve the party's interests, including keeping the party's survival and welfare in mind, rather than the country's survival and welfare in mind. So I think this is an important point, and I wanted to make that.
Yeah, and coming to the specifics of negotiation, I won't give everything out, so the viewers can actually go and read the book. But a couple of points that I want to mention, which makes a lot of sense when I read this. You mentioned a couple of things, like, for example, preparation of every aspect of negotiation that the Chinese go through. And another point is the Chinese network of think tanks was actually also used in probably an agenda setting, or probably giving out a view. And after that, you mentioned a lot of different things, which I won't really touch upon in detail, but for if you want to talk about, is that for Chinese to negotiate is to deceive. And you mentioned that Indians should always accept something in written form rather than in oral form. And there's a psychological, in the sense as well, a point where they actually know, they will set the location, how they will speak, how actually they will interact, make you feel ease. So how well are these negotiators trained, and what are these tactics that are being used? If you could tell us in detail.
When I say that, Chinese negotiate to deceive, I don't mean it in a pejorative way, because deception is a part of any country's strategy, and it is a part of diplomacy. The point I wanted to make was that we need to be aware that in the Chinese negotiating culture, deception is seen as a very routine and legitimate part of their negotiating behavior. And for that reason, it is important not to accept statements in an oral form, but in writing, where the putting down of words on the paper narrows their capacity to give different interpretations to it. That is why, China has always had a written tradition. It has a huge history of record keeping, and it believes in the power of the written word. We are a civilization with almost no written tradition, because the whole tradition of India is of an oral tradition, shruti. You transmit great documents as well as routine language of daily life orally, not through writing. So we approach this negotiation from very different perspectives. And while we must maintain our own perspective, we need to bear in mind the other side's perspective. So it is in that context that I said that, deception is something which we must accept routinely and guard against. Now, as the other tactics, of course, I don't want to say too much, because I hope that your listeners will buy the book. But the point I want to make is that we must not assume that because the Chinese don't speak fluent English, and many of them do, by the way, or because they are different from Westerners whom we are used to dealing with, that they are somewhat clumsy in their diplomacy. China has had a very fine historical tradition of diplomacy, and their diplomacy has been different. In a sense, for example, Western diplomacy, or even the diplomacy of through Indian history, has essentially been imposing your will on a neighbor through conquest. You conquer territory. In the case of China, it was not conquest ever. It was a tribute. It was a tributary state. In other words, you exercise your overlordship over a neighboring country by ensuring that the king of that country or the ruler of that country paid a certain amount of money and accepted you as the overlord. So this is just one example of how the Chinese approach to diplomacy is different from ours. And these are little things that we don't pay attention to, that we need to pay attention to, which otherwise land up in giving an advantage to the other side. One specific example I mentioned was the use of silence. if I say something and in India the other side is silent, you can make either the optimistic assumption that she or he agrees with me, or you can make the relatively balanced assumption that she or he will think about it. With Chinese, if they are silent, the assumption you must automatically make is either that they are in complete disagreement with it, or that they have some other motive in mind. So what I'm saying is that it is important to understand the negotiating culture of another country. And it is not the same if you negotiate with the Americans or with the Germans or with the Chinese. Negotiating with all three involve not only relative size and weight, because that's obvious, but also the environment and culture they come from. And that's why the study of international relations is so crucial, because we sometimes make mistakes in believing that we can negotiate a trade agreement with Singapore the same way that we negotiate it with Spain. That's not possible. The Singaporeans negotiate it differently. And very often, people in India don't have that depth of experience and knowledge to know that a Singaporean will think and act differently from a Spaniard. So this was my way of just trying to sort of simplify and hope that people in future would better understand Chinese thinking in this regard.
Yeah, and since you mentioned this very important part, and I just like to emphasize once more on that in the book also mentioned that China's network of think tanks actually produce a very accurate depiction of what the Indians might think like, or what the cultural part or this entire strategic part as well. Do you think in India we are lacking that sort of a network of think tanks to actually produce for our counterparts when we go out for negotiations? So you have been for negotiations from your personal experience, if you could tell us.
We were lacking this to a substantial extent for much of the time that I served in government. But I think we are now beginning to build that system of think tanks and institutions. That includes institutions which are non-governmental, like the ORF or the Center for Policy Research, or or even Carnegie and Brookings branches in India, as well as universities like Ashoka, Jindal, Shiv Nadar, Symbiosis, Geetham, and so on, which encourage international relations. Now, the key, of course, is to link the two. You have to be able to link the government with the outside expertise, and or for that matter, you have to link international Indian business with that outside expertise, or Indian media with that outside expertise. And that means you have to make it relevant for international relations to be, a job-worthy commodity. Let me put it that way. It is only when people see the link between studying international relations or foreign languages and livelihood that the system will take off. Now, we are therefore still at the takeoff stage. We have a number of these institutions, but we need to multiply them manifold. And we need to get government more involved in helping this process as well. And I think that too is happening, because when government sets up platforms like the Raisina Dialogue, or the Global Technology Summit in Bangalore, or the Asian Economic Dialogue in Pune, for instance, these are just three examples. You actually encourage government and experts to come on the same platform. You develop a familiarity, and hopefully that goes on to become institutional. So what I can say is the Chinese are institutionally ahead of us, but we are catching up. And perhaps in terms of research work, we might be as good as them, because some of their research work is heavily tinted by ideology, whereas a lot of our research work is really independent and based on open source knowledge, which can be verified, and is therefore likely to be more objective.
Yeah, but since you're mentioning this, the access to the top leadership as well, right? In the Chinese party, you will see that it's very rare, right? We just probably get a spokesperson, or at the hand we don't get anyone. We probably ask a person who represents the party, or probably a professor from a university. Whereas our counterparts actually try to give either the foreign secretary, or probably a top diplomat, or the foreign minister himself. So the access to both the parties is also very distinctive, right, in the way we look at.
Yeah, so that's part of culture. That's again part of the culture, and we have to be conscious of that. This is a system which is not comfortable with ad hocism, with on-the-spot negotiation, and so on. That's just the way they are made, and we are made differently. The trick is in understanding that they are made differently than we are, and adjusting strategy and tactics accordingly. The error is when we believe that everyone thinks and does and acts like we do. That's where a mistake is made. And so I think that's really the reason for writing this book. The last chapter in particular is to give anybody who is interested in China the idea of how the other side does and thinks, which is very different from the way we think and do.
Yeah. And since we're running out of time, I'll just ask one last question before I let you go. So in the book, you mentioned about this very interesting thing, and I've made sure that I end with this question. You said, and I quote, the Chinese imbue each word and gesture with meaning and purpose like an actor or player in a drama. Initially, and you also spoke about 2 or 3, I think, proverbs that they put in the sentence to make it sound. And you later on go on to talk about the wolf warrior. We are seeing a more aggressive kind of negotiators and diplomats around. And you also mentioned that it's a part of the theatrics of the Chinese play. So how have you seen the evolved in negotiation, not just in the Indian side, but also the Chinese side throughout the course of the book that you mentioned? And the second part is, throughout the book, we have always felt that India is the country which has always, if not deceived, been not on the same level playing ground as the Chinese are. Are there instances where the Chinese also got deceived by India's negotiations or diplomacy?
Oh yeah, plenty of times. I don't think we should give China we should not lionize China to the point of believing that they have been successful all the time. In fact, my assumption is that in recent years, they have been less successful with India because I think sometimes they have taken us for granted and perhaps they don't understand us very well either. That is also a reason for falling scholarship on India in China. But when all diplomacy is theater. It's like acting in a movie for all of us, whether you're an American diplomat, an Indian diplomat, or a Chinese diplomat. The thing is, the Chinese style is a little different. And we need to understand that style. Otherwise, we will make mistakes. And I just give a few examples. For instance, nobody in the Chinese delegation except the leader will speak. As Indians, we all like to speak. And that's true of the Americans and the Europeans as well. But that's all right. So when we have a negotiation with the Americans, saying more is better. But that is not the case with the Chinese. It is better to say less, hear them out more, watch what the negotiator is actually doing with her or his hands and other behavioral traits rather than simply hear the voice and the words and sort of understand, which is why I have a sentence which says words and messages, words and gestures convey messages, not emotion. So by the same token, wolf warrior diplomacy is not an emotion. It is a message. And therefore, it is just one more facet of Chinese diplomacy. We need not get fazed about it. In fact, my own advice is we should just ignore it and look beyond it and continue to negotiate the way we do. And once they realize that this is not going to faze us, they will come back to a more normal behavior with us. This is a put on. We all do a put on. With diplomacy, this is a put on.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and being on the show. I definitely recommend this book to all my viewers, and I'll put the link to buy the book. Thank you once again for taking your time and being on the show, sir.
Thank you, Ratnadeep. Thank you. It was a pleasure.